What's your family story worth to you? And I'm not talking about the shiny ones that everybody knows about. I mean the buried ones, the secrets, the heartbreaks, the ones that only slipped out after a night of too much Hennessy. That's what Vietnam Story Bank is for. No polish, no rewrites, no editing, just raw, recorded, beautiful beating history. The kind that makes you sit up and hold your breath. Your father's memories of his mother's wildest dreams, your grandparents' laughter that echoes in your bones. We dig it all up, we record it, and hand it back to you, safe, untouchable, and unforgettable. Because when your stories disappear, they're gone forever. So go to VietnamStoryBank.com today and make sure your family's stories are recorded. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
So let's go back to the early years. What drew you into the Vietnam War?
Well, as I said, it's a bit of a path, which I'll explain. So I've always been, as a young child, I was very interested in historical mysteries. You know, what happened to Custard Little Bighorn? What happened to the Tsar? And I was always interested in what happened to the American POWs that didn't come home. And so one day, many years ago, I was doing some research in the Library of Congress on a totally different subject. And I found this article on American MIAs, and I photocopied it and I mailed it to a guy I knew who was doing research in this area. And he called me up and he asked me to join him to do research at the Carlisle Army Barracks, which is the home of the U.S. Army War College. And so we walk into this room and it's just filled with all these file cabinets of documents that the U.S. military had flown out of Saigon in 1972. And they've just been declassified by the archivist and stuck in there. So I started going through the folders and I started finding the reports of the Joint Personnel Recovery Center, which was the unit responsible for recovering both American and South Vietnamese POWs. And I thought to myself, I've heard of these guys, but I've never really seen anybody write about them. So when I went home and I looked it up, I realized I was right. And I had one of those kind of aha moments. And I thought, well, here's my chance to, I always wanted to be a writer. I always wanted to be a historian. So here was my chance to go down that path. And so I went back there 10 times, went through every folder in that room and found most of the reports. And they had the original signature blocks of the officers who were involved. And I tracked them down. And that became codenamed Bright Light, my first book. But as it became deeper and deeper into the issue, I realized one could not really understand the MIA issue without understanding the war itself. So I started going to conferences, and one of the conferences I went to, I met this former U.S. advisor who told me about Colonel Lê Minh Dao, what a great officer he was, and how he had done so well at the Battle of Sun Lap in April of 1975. And so again, I had an aha moment, and we decided to go interview him. And that put me down the path of then talking about the South Vietnamese. So I've been fortunate that a lot of things that I wanted to do kind of came fruition at the right points.
When I was growing up and I saw the flags, the black flag of the POW MIA,
yes.
I was always wondering, why would the North Vietnamese government want to open their doors up for U.S. to come in to look for their personnel? I mean, after all, we just finished a war on April 30, 1975. Like, what's the point of letting the U.S. in? What's the incentive for the Vietnamese government?
Well, so that was a long diplomatic and arduous diplomatic process to finally get the Vietnamese to allow our joint search teams to come back in. But it was mainly wrapped up in a bunch of different political issues. A lot of it had to do with recognition of the country, lifting the trade embargo, which was devastating to North Vietnam's, or at that time, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam's economy. You had the boat people issue. You had Cambodia. You had the war with the Chinese on the northern border. So over time, and yes, the Vietnamese were extremely reluctant to allow Americans back in, but all these international factors, and sometime between the end of the war in 1985, finally convinced the Vietnamese, yeah, it was time to let's sort of go back and look at this issue and let the Americans in and search for their missing.
Who spearheaded this?
Well, I mean, the U.S. government had been suffering under charges of, so take a step back for a second. There was several hundred, probably almost 400 guys at the end of the war for which U.S. intelligence had knowledge that the Vietnamese had knowledge about their fates. There was either pictures or there was radio broadcasts or something that we believe the Vietnamese knew what happened to these guys who did not return in 73. So the U.S. government continued to pressure the Vietnamese about that, even though they sort of internally believed all the Americans were dead. There was a lot of families who did not accept that until they could actually see, bones. So the families pressured the U.S. government, and the U.S. government in turn engaged with the Vietnamese government to try to get answers. But it really wasn't until the Reagan administration that this became a higher national priority, to the point where President Reagan was sending U.S. emissaries over there to negotiate with the Vietnamese to allow access.
And you just said that the Vietnamese government believed that most of these guys were not alive anymore.
No, the American government probably didn't believe that. The Vietnamese government, we believe and still do believe the Vietnamese government knew exactly what happened to the vast majority of these guys. Not everybody, perhaps, but the vast majority of these guys. And we're holding out knowledge of their fates for either economic or political gain.
I could see that as leverage.
Leverage, precisely correct, yeah.
But I often wondered how many of these men, and I don't mean to make this light or make it a silly thing or an angle, but I always thought to myself, like, how many of these men really survived and fell in love with women in Vietnam and just stayed and didn't want to go back to the US?
Well, that was always a great question in the early days. Was there some guy who crashed out in the middle of nowhere, Laos, and just decided to stay in the local village? But that was never a particular high number. And quite frankly, if you think about it, it's pretty ludicrous on its face, because what highly trained American pilot was going to want to stay in some jungle hut somewhere? These guys wanted to come home. They wanted to come home ASAP. So there may have been deserters. That was always a bigger question. American deserters during the war who had made a living for themselves or married locally and just didn't want to come home in either 73 or 75. But again, that number, and you have to remember something, the Vietnamese government also, I think in August of 75, began kicking out all the foreigners, most of them who were in Saigon, guys who had just stayed there after the withdrawal. They started kicking these guys out, including the French.
They didn't lock them up or anything. They just asked them to leave.
They just said, "You're persona non grata, time to go home." And so they just got rid of you. They just started. And the U.S. government was happy to get an accounting for some of these guys. People who had been on the deserter rules for many years. They wanted to know what happened to them.
Can you walk me through sort of like the basic timeline of, you said Reagan, and then I'd imagine John McCain and Clinton, all these men were trying to go into to make the deal happen. Can you kind of walk me through that timeline?
Well, so again, because there was a tremendous amount of pressure from the remaining families, people who are still MIA, especially from those who did not have an answer or whose relative was, again, what they call last known alive, LKA, to get an accounting, to pressure the Vietnamese government to tell us what happened to these guys. And so that sort of pressure sparked a little bit of an industry of people claiming, oh, the U.S. government knew these guys were alive and they just deliberately abandoned them, which again was complete rubbish. But that kind of conspiracy thinking caught fire. And so by the mid 80s, there was a large number of people who thought, well, there's still guys alive over there. It's only been 10 years and these guys were young. They could still be alive. So Reagan, who had expressed interest in this from very early on when he was still governor of California, decided that he was going to do something about it. And so he brought on Vietnam veterans onto the National Security Council, who are also very interested in this. And they began the process of re-engaging with the Vietnamese government to discuss two things: allowed Americans back into the country to do searches, and two, to be able to get the Vietnamese to turn over to us remains of that we knew that they had recovered and were stored. Because you have to remember something, there were thousands and thousands of refugees coming out of Vietnam at this point in time, and they were interviewed by American MIA investigators, and they would say, oh yeah, I helped dig up this aircraft, and the bones were taken by the Vietnamese government and taken to Hanoi. So we knew that there was people out there that the Vietnamese had recovered, an unknown set of remains. And so Reagan began the process, and by the late 80s, the government, U.S. government, had convinced the Vietnamese to turn over several hundred of these remains under a humanitarian thing. And it was sort of a quid pro quo, without saying it was a quid pro quo, that we would then start a process of recognizing the Vietnam and the United Nations, of talking about lifting the trade embargo, of helping South Vietnamese people flee the country without, having to risk their lives in rickety boats. So there was this, you have to understand the MIA issue was the basis for the eventual reestablishment of diplomatic relations. It was the driver of the train, but addressed a whole host of other issues, including Agent Orange, unexploded ordnance, disabled people. So it was really sort of the impetus for a lot of other issues to be addressed.
Do you think that if there was no POW MIA pressure from internally from the US, that the other things would not have taken place, such as the embargo lifting or any sort of future support? Do you think that because of that leveraging, that the Vietnamese government was able to have something on the US and say, let's make a deal?
Well, no, in the broader sense, I think that diplomatic relations would have been eventually reestablished, because I said it was more than just the MIA issue. It was the boat people. It was the war in Cambodia. It's a bunch of other issues. And so I think eventually there would have been pressure. And I think actually that diplomatic recognition and lifting the trade embargo were delayed probably a good 7, 8, 9 years because of the MIA issue, because the families were vehemently against all those things, because they thought that we had leverage. This was our leverage on the Vietnamese to get them to release what happened to our men. And so when Clinton lifted the trade embargo and Clinton made diplomatic, the families were devastated, because that to them was throwing away our only bargaining chips.
A great answer. That's the type of answer that I'm going to go back and listen to this again to find out, because that's such a nuanced thing, right? You think that it's tit for tat, but it's like, actually it slowed down the process of this whole thing. Now, I want to know, in your research, how much recovery and how accurate was the identification process?
I'm not sure what you mean by how much recovery. So since the end of the war, they've recovered and identified about 1,000 MIAs. There's still 1,584, I think, is the last estimate. Not estimate, but the number. Now, some of those, they're never going to recover. They're over-the-water losses. Some guy on an outpost got hit with an artillery shell and just vaporized them. But there are still a lot of people that they can, or the bodies may have been recovered and then lost, or whatever happened. So the identification process has gone through some challenges historically over the years. There was a huge dust up in the 80s about this. The laboratory that was designed to do the identifications was not certified. That caused a huge uproar. That got taken care of. Now the lab, which used to be called Silhai, has dramatically improved itself, but there's still questions about, are they using the most recent DNA process and things like that. So DNA now has become another, if not the most important tool in the toolkit, where it used to before be, dental or things of that nature, or, dog tags on the guy,
How much heat is still on the POW MIA issue in DC and in America?
I would say that it is a cold flame anymore. It's certainly after 50 years, no longer among what you might call overriding issues between us and Vietnam. There are far more other things that the U.S. government, especially a Democratic government, Democratic Party government finds more important. And they range from, and they're right in some ways, they range from intellectual property protections to police cooperation to other things. And so over the years, as the process is continued and seems to be doing okay, it sort of fell down the priority list for the US government, even though they still say, oh, it's a number one priority. So as the US government was falling down, the families were getting older, people were dying, they lost, I wouldn't say lost interest, but the country began to lose interest in it. So if you compare the early 80s to now, it is vastly, vastly lowered.
Yeah, I can imagine, because if it's like your parent, if you were a parent and one of your sons was missing, if you were alive, then you're going to do everything in your power to lobby the
Well, you
government.
don't know what happened to him. That's
Right.
the thing. If you don't know, and especially if there's a photograph published of this guy, with a bayonet to his back and he's alive on the ground and he doesn't come home. I mean, what would you do if you were a parent,
Mm. And if the parents are all gone, there's no more heat. And if the siblings were young, they're probably in their 70s or 60s today, that probably have given hope of any return. So,
Well, fortunately, the National League of POW and MIA Families continues to press vociferously for answers, continues to try to educate the American public, works closely with the veteran service organizations, continues to pressure the U.S. government, Congress, Special Forces Association to continue this as a priority and to make it a priority in U.S. Vietnam relations. Not as successfully as they once did, but they're still out there fighting the good fight.
in your work, did you ever have to go to Vietnam?
No, I'm not. I've only been to Vietnam twice, and that was last year. But that was and once with the first time I went was with the National League of Families. But I'm a Cold Warrior, not a Vietnam vet.
So yeah, you for the books that you wrote, you didn't ever have to go to Vietnam
No,
to
no.
do any of the work. Yeah, and I'd imagine a lot of the information is here in the United States.
Well, again, the first book was based on U.S. efforts, and they're based on U.S. records. The second book was the memoirs of Bill Bell, who just recently passed, who was an incredible American who, in an odd historical fact, was the last American, officially assigned American to Vietnam to get in a helicopter the morning of April 30th on the roof of the embassy. And he was the first officially assigned American to go back to Vietnam as the head of the new POW MIA office in 1988 or 9. And so the second book is his memoirs, how he went through things. And then I said, made that sort of turn onto a different path and started talking about the South Vietnamese.
How do you think that the whole POW MIA issue compares to all the other wars that the United States have fought? I mean, I think a lot about this because I'm Vietnamese, and my brain automatically goes to the black flag when I'm driving around the country. But how do you think the way the United States handled the Vietnamese Vietnam War, POW, MIA, compared to the Korean War, World War II, Iraq, Afghanistan? Like, somehow it sticks out to me more, but it's because of my relative bias being Vietnamese and part of that, world. But how does it compare to like other wars?
Well, you have to understand a couple things. It's you can't make a blanket comparison other than saying the Vietnam War, the issue was far more politically charged because during the war, the Vietnamese themselves, who had captured Americans, refused until later in the war to tell us who was alive and who was not alive. They restricted mail privileges. They refused to let the Red Cross come in, even though they had signed the Geneva Convention on POWs. So the Vietnamese, Hanoi during the war itself had politicized the issue, right? And because at that point in time, they were not saying, well, we've got these 12 guys, but these other 5 guys are dead. They wouldn't tell us that. The families began to pressure the U.S. government in the early years. And it wasn't until 1969, when Nixon came in, that the U.S. government changed its policy from one of quiet approach to the Vietnamese to one of publicly lambasting them for doing this. Okay. So the politicization of this had happened during the war, whereas it did not happen during World War I or II because the Germans allowed Red Cross visits, they allowed mail privileges, they exchanged lists because the Germans wanted to know their own guys. Whereas the Vietnamese communists they refused to admit that they had Northerners fighting in South Vietnam, right? It was all Southerners, right? The Korean War kind of began this because the Chinese had also politicized this. And in fact, the Chinese had taught the Vietnamese how to do this. And so they had, but that war was shorter and it was a different time. And so there was family pressure after the Korean War to find out what had happened to a lot of guys who were, again, known to be alive in captivity. And there was some initial family pushback, but it was just a different time. The 50s were different than the 60s and 70s, you know?
Well, thank you so much for really digging into this POW MIA. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about your journey into President Nguyễn Văn Thieu's life and legacy. You know, we did a podcast episode on one of my sub-series with Kevin Pham called The Viet History Makers. And we dug into Nguyen Van Thieu's life. And here we are today with you. And I want to hear about your journey and what made you interested in him. And let's talk a little bit about his life.
Well, I'd be interested to hear what you guys dug up because I remember when I was writing Drawn Swords that I had wanted to start off. Actually, the book was the beginning of the book was actually supposed to be sort of a biography of Thieu. And after about 5 months of trying to figure out where this guy had come from and stuff and running into wall after wall, I realized that this isn't what's going to work. So Drawn Swords took a different direction. So I would actually be curious what you guys found out because I spent a lot of time trying to figure out Thieu's early years, which are still very blank, other than, you know, where he was born and how many kids there were and stuff. So Thieu basically was born in a small village near Phan Rang on the coast. He, he came from more of a middle-class family than people realize. Not that he was wealthy or anything. He was a young kid. His older brothers were, one of them was a very well-educated through the French system, helped him get into some good schools in both Hue and then he dropped out of Hue and then he went to a school in Saigon. He briefly joined the Viet Minh when the rebellion started against the French. Pretty quickly realized that the Vietnamese were communists, left there, went back to Saigon, eventually joined the very first officer class that the French army had built for the Vietnamese. And then once he graduated as an infantry lieutenant, he had a series of assignments, both as a platoon leader and a company commander. And then he became known as a pretty good staff officer. He's a smart guy. And so he was sent to North Vietnam, where he was working in a sector south of Hanoi with other Vietnamese National Army officers. Came back, took part in some big operations at the end of the war, remained a staff officer, and was sort of anti-Diem and kind of got labeled that way and got stuck in a Dalat as the commandant for a while. And I think he realized, as he saw some of his contemporaries going like this, and he was still stuck here, that he had married a Catholic. So I think he realized that, well, if I'm going to advance, I'm going to need to, convert, and I'm going to need to, join the Can Lao party. And he did those things, and his career sort of took off. And he was known as a loyal officer. He had sort of switched from being anti-Zem to sort of, middle of the road kind of a guy, and rapidly rose to the ranks, became a division commander by 1962.
Yeah. he sounds like a very admirable man. And I want to ask you your opinion. If he was able to get more funding at the end of the war, do you think things might have changed for him?
Well, we need to back up for a second, because there was the American funding of the South Vietnamese military and the economy. And that's the thing that people always have to realize, that there was money for the military and there was money for the economy, and one was not more important than the other. Okay. Although you can say guns are more important because they keep the VC away, as opposed to, but so there was money there initially in 73, but the American government was hoping that there would be a ceasefire would stick, and so they wouldn't need to give all this military aid. And then the Arab-Israeli Yom Kippur War happened at the end of 73, and the Israelis sucked up all those, a lot of the material that was going to go to South Vietnam. And then, quite frankly, there was increasing pressure from the U.S. Congress, which was at that point very anti-South Vietnam, and particularly anti-Thieu, because they saw him as a military dictator, which was not even remotely true. And so they began to slash funding. And they began to slash military funding and economic funding. And not only did that impact how South Vietnam fought the war, and how South Vietnam tried to get itself out of what was economic depression, but the U.S. Congress slashed funding. So the funding is going down almost in precise parallel to as the North Vietnamese are ramping up attacks. So the two, and the North Vietnamese were doing it for two reasons. They saw a weakening South Vietnam and an America that was pulling out, and they were also recovering from their own disaster in the 72 offensive.
Yeah, these nuances are, for somebody like me who have not studied history deeply, just very superficial questions that, float around in my mind. But when we get to hear history, and I get to share this with the audience, we can have deeper discussions about the nuances of the way this all went down.
Right. So again, you have to understand that, as I wrote in Drawn Swords, is the 1972 offensive. Let me back up for a second. So after the 65 offensive, after the 68 offensive, the U.S. had helped rebuild South Vietnam both economically and militarily, right? But that was not true after the 72 offensive. You've got to remember something. 68, the offensive was directed at the cities, all right, trying to topple the South Vietnamese government. The 72 offensive was targeted at the countryside because they had pushed the communists back across the border, so they had to launch their offensive from further away, right? And so the damage in the countryside was tremendous, and it destroyed the years of building that the U.S. government and the South Vietnamese government had done since 68. So when the Paris Peace Accords are signed and America withdraws, we leave behind a badly weakened South Vietnam, because now we're not rebuilding South Vietnam like we did in 65 and 68, right? Even though we had sort of said we'll continue to support you. So that's the problem. And then you've got these international factors. And that's one of the things that most people are unable to grasp, is how much international factors affected what happened in Vietnam and affected the war. You got the Yom Kippur War. You have the oil shock and oil embargo because of it, which all these things dramatically influenced the economy. And as I try to tell people, everybody looks at war as the number one factor, and that's true. But you've also got to look at economic issues as 1A, okay? Because how people survive, how they eat, how they buy things, because there's no such thing as total mobilization, right? It's a myth. Yeah. You've got to understand that any economy is still producing goods for a civilian sector, especially one that's like South Vietnam. The North is only producing goods for their local people, but meant to support the war effort. So anyways, long story is that By 73, you had a badly weakened South Vietnam. Then you had international economic factors that made it even worse. And so by mid 74, South Vietnam was already starting to lose ground.
So it was going to be very difficult to really finish and win that.
Well, if we had continued, I think if we had continued to provide them the economic and military aid that we had promised, I think South Vietnam would have gone through a rough patch. But I think if we could have helped them to hang on for 5 more years, I think what would have happened is that a new generation of officers would have replaced some of the the remaining old guard. I think you would have had a maturing military that was American trained. I think you would have had an economy that was recovering. And I think you would have had enough Vietnamese at that point that were determined then to support the government and support the fight. And the other issue you've got to remember about South Vietnam, and this is what I always sort of try to tell people in terms of Americans anyways, who said, oh, the South Vietnamese were, they failed, blah, blah, blah. Defending South Vietnam as a military guy is extremely difficult. You've got the DMZ, and then you've got this extremely long western flank that's covered in jungles and mountains, right? And it's very easy for an enemy army to hide, mass, and attack, And you only got a couple of roads, and it's just, and when you've got a 1,300 mile long western flank to defend, not as easy as it sounds.
Do you think, from your perspective, that there has ever been any U.S. military intervention in any country that has led to successful outcomes of what the U.S. wanted? Or has it just been, let's just spend a bunch of money on defense or weapons? And
it's always extraordinarily difficult to put foreign troops into any country. But if you look at certain things like Panama, for example, you could point to some other things like the Philippines in the 1890s, where American troops did some successful things. The problem always is that the U.S. military or any military is a blunt instrument, and you bring in a lot of firepower. Got to build bases, got to build roads, got to build an infrastructure. Puts people, there's just a lot of different things to it. So I think the question you want to ask, was it smart to put U.S. troops into the Vietnam conflict? That is always an interesting counterfactual, because in some ways I think no, because it gave the communists the ultimate propaganda. Then, we got to defeat the invading Americans, beat the foreigners, which any country would use. But the other side is, could the South Vietnamese government have efficiently defended the country against what ultimately became an invasion from North Vietnam? And again, you've got that long western flank that makes it very difficult. So it's an interesting counterfactual, but will remain always a counterfactual forever. You can have an opinion that I think on either side is right.
But we think about Afghanistan, Middle East, Iraq. Are we winning anything? By going into and propping our troops up, are we doing any good work out there in the world?
Well, it all boils down to strategy. What is is it a direct strategy? Is it an indirect strategy the U.S. is applying? What strategy is the enemy using? And the problem that you have with both Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan is that all 3 of those conflicts had border sanctuaries for the enemy to retreat across the border and recuperate that we did not go into. Okay. And when you're playing an active defense, okay, ultimately you're on the defensive, and that's going to lead to problems. And if there had been no border readouts for the People's Army to retreat back, there's no way that the North Vietnamese army could have survived on the battlefield against either the South Vietnamese, the Koreans, Australians, or us.
You know, you're dispelling a lot of, or you're making things more clear for me. But has there been any misconceptions you think about the Vietnam War that that you've discovered on this journey?
Well, I think the biggest one is, and one I've spent the last 20 years trying to dispel, is this image of the South Vietnamese military as this corrupt, cowardly, poor leadered, poor led unit. And certainly there were aspects of that. Certainly there were large aspects of that. But you find that in any army. You find good units and you find bad units. So what I always tell my fellow historians and also fellow citizens, and I think I've been successful in this in some way because there's been a real push in the last 15 years, not because of me, to look at South Vietnam differently now, not as this corrupt dictatorship, but looking at it as a country. But I think that what I always said to people was, if you're going to talk about the bad things, you also got to be able to talk about the good things. You have to achieve a balance. So if Unit A broke and ran at the first contact with the communist unit, but Unit B stood and fought and kicked the other guy's butt, you got to be able to talk about both. You just can't keep harping on the bad stuff. And so that's, I think, the biggest myth that I've worked 20 years to dispel.
Yeah, and I'm hearing a lot of it. You know, the qualities, the good qualities of the South. I'm hearing it. There's a resurgence, or there's a sort of you know, with people like Alex Tai and Dr. Tung Vo. These men are, you know, I think they're reframing the narrative, and I welcome, you know, all the narratives that are coming, because I think when we are able to talk about these things in our community and in America and in Vietnam, because this podcast will travel to Vietnam, and I think that it's good to know everything that has happened. You know, keeping a balanced perspective of the North and the South, I think, are important things for all of us to kind of like be better people.
Well, I think your point of reframing the narrative is exactly right. So there's been, as I said, a push in the last 10 to 15 years to re-examine South Vietnam and to look at it as an entity. The academic word that's bandied about is called agency. You know, were they actually able to do, you know, were they not puppets of the Americans, as the communists claim? But in fact, if you start digging into it, you very quickly discover that the South Vietnamese government, its people, its military, were very much doing things on their own in conjunction with the Americans. And it's almost laughable, actually, if you, to call them puppets, because the Americans would try to suggest things to the South Vietnamese. Hey, do it this way, or suggest things to Thieu. And, you know, half the time they just did what they wanted to do for very Vietnamese reasons, not American reasons. And so this re-looking at South Vietnam has blossomed a great deal, especially in the last 5 years. And I think now most scholars will say, you know, South Vietnam was a far more complex and better society than it was ever given credit for at the time or shortly after the war by the anti-war folks.
How do you think that this Vietnam War has affected U.S. foreign policy today?
Well, for many years, especially in the 90s, there were, you know, as we were looking at Iraq and everything, there was, you know, a chant of no more Vietnams, that this had become the quote quagmire that America had bogged down to, that it had destroyed or torn apart the fabric of American society, the worst way since the Civil War, perhaps. That it had really, and this is a phrase that I hear a lot of people bandy about, which annoys me too. It displayed the limits of American power, which we need a much deeper discussion on that, not here, but historiography. And so I think that once Iraq 1 happened, and Bush then said, "Oh, you know, the Vietnam syndrome is over." That was, I think, a watershed in terms of Vietnam studies.
When I think about the work that you do, clearly you're a white man, and clearly
Thank you.
you're writing about a country that you're not from. How do you keep sort of the idea of balancing your views as an American, as a white man, writing about the nuances of this country. And you know, in the beginning, when I was first starting out, I really did not know how many academics wrote about Vietnam and the Vietnam War, and how many Vietnamese were. I didn't know the body of work that was out there. Now I'm learning now that there are many Americans and foreign people from outside of Vietnam that are very knowledgeable about the Vietnam War and the history of Vietnam. But I'm curious to hear how that feels.
So to answer your second point first, the thing that I tried to do in both Black April and Drawn Swords was, and every historian, whether they consciously or unconsciously, shapes the book based upon preconceived ideas or their own biases. And I recognized that. And so I tried to keep myself and my thoughts out of this as much as I possibly could. So both books were deliberately done from the viewpoint of the Vietnamese, on both sides. And so when I especially Drawn Swords, I tried to avoid any American interpretations of what Thieu was doing or what the South Vietnamese doing. You know, some embassy official writing a paper says, "Oh, but they're doing this as X and Y," and I tried to avoid using it. I tried to use Vietnamese interpretations, or as much as possible, what Thieu himself was saying. Here's the reason why we're doing this. And when you take it from that perspective, pretty soon, I always said to people, like, I had such a sense for the guy after a while that I began to be able to sort of know what he was thinking. Not that I ever met him or anything,
I
but
get it.
you kind of get in someone's shoes.
Yep.
So anyways, my point of it is that I tried to write it from what the perspective of the Vietnamese and not the perspective of the Americans, which is the problem with most American writers writing about the Vietnamese. They're looking at some embassy report and using that. And so I went out and found every Vietnamese book I could find, memoir written about that, and had it translated. The second point is to how many people are out there. Quite frankly, the Vietnam historiography field is pretty narrow anymore. Vietnam books don't sell that well. It's nothing compared. Even World War II books right now dramatically outsell Vietnam War books.
Wow.
Unfortunately, yes.
Who are some of the Viet historians, whether they're white, Vietnamese, or otherwise, that you respect and follow, that you could suggest to the audience, hey, look into these writers?
So I have a couple of dear friends who I think are some of the finest Vietnam scholars in the world. When you're talking about the French Indochina War in the early years, Christopher Gaucher in Montreal is perhaps the best Vietnam scholar in the world. In terms of the Second Indochina War, Pierre Oslin, San Diego State, is just a huge fan of his. He writes beautifully. He speaks Vietnamese. He speaks French. He's done a fabulous job. He would consider himself a diplomatic historian, so he's kind of on that side. When it comes to sort of the sort of military historians, Mark Moyer, who's again writing from the American perspective, has done fabulous work. There are others like Ed Miller, who's written a book on Diem, which was extremely well done. There's Gregory Daddis, who's done great work too on some of the American stuff. And then there's a handful of other people who have written 1 volumes or a couple other things. But really, my main go-to guys are Chris Gaucher, Pierre Oslin, Mark Moyer, and a few others.
But no Vietnamese historians.
Tung Vu, I think, is fabulous. I love his stuff. He's a tremendous writer. Does a really good job of. But again, Tung specializes in like sort of Vietnamese internal relations. Pierre's a diplomatic historian. Chris is a First Indochina War. Mark is like an American historian. I try to cover all the bases, perhaps so they do things really well in their specialties, whereas I'm sort of like in the middle shot group, as we used to say.
So Tung Vu is the only person, huh? I mean, are there any other?
I have to think about it. I'm sure leaving a bunch of guys out. I mean, Alex Taiba, as you mentioned, does a really good job. Ben
Sorry,
Marshall.
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
That's okay. Like, I don't show this to my friends because they'll be like, "Why didn't you mention me?" And I'm like, "Well, I got a little camera shy."
Well,
Van
maybe you could say,
Marshall
yeah.
Van Marshall Wynn's book is very good. There's other people out there.
If you could speak directly to the youth in Vietnam and the Vietnamese diaspora youth, what would you want them to kind of understand about this world? What's the takeaway for the Vietnamese people all around the world from your
Well,
perspective?
I wouldn't say it's a takeaway per se, but I'll tell you something that I've repeated in the many, many, many times I've spoken before Vietnamese audiences. And that is, I encourage people on the Republican side to write their memoirs. And I use the same old phrase that even if you were a sergeant in the motor pool, write down what you did during the war, because once they're gone forever, right? And the communists are certainly not going to enhance their memoirs. So get your parents to tell you what they did. Write down what they did. Publish it in English. Make sure you understand what they're telling you, because I can't do my job as a historian without their memories, without their documents. And so what I was doing in Black April, and this may amuse your listeners, is that a lot of times some of the officers were very reluctant to tell me about a battle. And I understood it was revisiting a painful past that they had tried to forget. They tried to go on their lives, or they felt something, embarrassment about it, or they were just very reluctant to talk to me as a foreigner, or they were reluctant to talk about themselves. That's that Buddhist, reserve, sort of thing. So I developed a technique where I would say, okay, well, I appreciate that, but here's what the communists have written about the battle. And I would slide the papers from the communist account of the battle and give it to them. And I said, I guess I'm just going to have to go with this, right? And they would look at it and they would start going, oh, this is wrong. No, this is BS. This is wrong. And I said, well, maybe you could tell me what your side of it. And then magically they would open up, So I just think that, there's very few. Every day there's fewer and fewer of these guys, and their memories are going, their healths are going. They just don't want to screw with it anymore. But it's imperative to get down as much as we can about what they were going through during that time.
Okay, so this answer that you just gave me brings me to another line of questioning. The communists have their accounts.
Correct.
And you're saying, not a whole lot of on the South Vietnamese side now have their accounts, and you have an idea of what the other side of the communists have written about. But how much of those accounts for you are accurate? How much of the portrayal makes sense to your writing? Like, how much do you integrate from their perspective?
Well, so there are two answers to that. First off, the communists have written extensively. I mean, extensively about the war, and that's again something that I try to use as a prod to my South Vietnamese friends to get them to write. I said, listen, if you go and not tell what happened, and once you're gone, then the communist account is the only account standing, and that's what American historians are going to use. Do you want that to happen? So it's a way of sort of prodding them. And so you have to take the communist accounts and the South Vietnamese accounts very carefully, because everybody's got a bias. Everybody's got a, sort of. And so I've learned that there are certain aspects to communist accounts of the battle, units involved, what happened, when they started, that you can pretty much depend on. But there's other accounts that are still very propagandistic. We shot down 1,100 American airplanes and lost one guy, kind of stuff. So it's always about double checking and triple checking at some point. So I never use their accounts or the South Vietnamese accounts without confirming it, unless I'm really 100% sure the source is accurate. The second thing is, it's not accurate to say that the South Vietnamese people have not published stuff. They have published, actually, quite a bit. I mean, there's the Rangers, the Airborne, Marines, the Navy, the Air Force have a association magazine. There's people who have published their memoirs. So there's a very large body of work out there, but it's fragmented, right? And so one of the things I've heard to do over time was sort of like create these indexes to things so that when I'm gone or done with this, people behind me will be able to see this. But the problem is that it's, it's all in Vietnamese. Um, and most American historians don't speak Vietnamese. And so it's not easy to translate because there's a lot of military lingo and stuff. So that's why I say, get their stories and have them translated into English so that people can use them. But we really need to be able to create sort of a gigantic finding aid to the South Vietnamese story. Here's all the articles. Here's what they're about. Here's all the books, And I did some of that, but I'm just a one-man band, as they say.
You devoted basically your entire adult life into these themes of the Vietnam War. If you didn't do this, what do you think you would be writing about?
Well, I didn't devote my entire adult life, but I've given about quite a few years.
Yeah.
Um,
You have like a lot of books out about the Vietnam War. I mean,
yeah, well,
it's
I got one
extensive.
more. I got one more, maybe two more in me because I keep taking on these really complex challenges that just suck the energy right out of you trying to do it. People always think, "Oh, writing a book," and I say it's not hard
No.
work because I think digging a ditch is hard work.
Yeah.
I've never found the right way to say it, but let me just tell you, it's a heck of a lot harder than you think it is.
Yeah.
Um, so what would I be writing about? That's a great question. I've never even thought of that. I don't really have a good answer for it. Um, Probably some other historical mystery, I guess, that captured my fancy.
Yeah, because it's you know the Buddhist side of our culture believes that we've lived previous lives, and whenever I encounter somebody like you, I'm like, what did you where did you spend time in a
Oh yeah,
previous
well,
life?
my one of my best Vietnamese friend years ago, because I've eaten more bowls of pho than most Americans, right? And we were out one night, and he just looked at me and he goes, "Because you're not Vietnamese, but you're Vietnamese in the stomach." Meaning because I've eaten so much Vietnamese food. So I always say I'm Vietnamese in the stomach. So
Well, let me if respectfully correct you. When he says that, the Vietnamese means the stomach is actually the mind.
oh really?
Yeah, it's the heart. It's where we think. So they say "A chung bụng," which is this is where your thoughts are coming from. So he's saying you're Vietnamese from deep inside your thinking. So
Okay, I did not know that. Thank you. Well, I'm not now. I'm a little not. First, I thought it was like he was just making a joke that was pretty
no,
funny. But now okay. Now I'm touched.
yeah, the literal translation means heart. I'm sorry, it's stomach. The literal translation is stomach, but the inference that what they're really saying is your
So,
soul, your mind is Vietnamese from the stomach is where we place our thoughts.
okay. Well, thank
It's
you.
a yeah, it's a deep place. We are at the 50-year mark here in April. What gives you hope when you think about Vietnam today?
Hope in what sense?
I knew you were going to ask that. Hope, hope for the future of I think Vietnam and the country and the people.
Well, I mean, I would always hope for two things. One is that Hanoi itself would make the decision to reconcile with its past and reconcile with the South Vietnamese people, to recognize that these people fought for their own ideals. They were not American puppets, and it wouldn't be that hard to. And I've been to the Benoit Cemetery. I've been to the Tomb of the Unknown. And it was funny when I was there in October and we went to the Tomb of the Unknown, which Thieu had built. And you walk up the steps, and a lot of the place is, not well taken care of. But I got to tell you, I was shocked when I walked into the main inside of it, and there was incense burning on the altar. And I thought to myself, holy gee, someone is coming here and still paying their respects to the dead 49 and a half years after the war is over. I mean, somebody still remembers what's going
Mm.
on. I had no idea who it was. And so I thought to myself at the time, how hard would it be for the current Vietnamese government to recognize the sacrifices of all these other Vietnamese people during the war and stuff? And so that reconciliation, I think, needs to happen between the Vietnamese people. And the second thing is, I would always, of course, hope for a democracy to arise in Vietnam as opposed to a one-party rule.
What do you think stopping the Vietnamese government from acknowledging the South?
Well, they built their legitimacy upon leading the country into both the war against the French, independence against the French, and then war for reunification against the Americans. And they painted the South Vietnamese as puppets and traitors, race traitors. And so for them to suddenly go back on all that, I think is going to be a huge step psychologically, because now it calls into question, why did we fight the war? And why did we, the North Vietnamese, fight the war? To what end? Because they took staggering casualties. I mean, I've actually seen their official number of killed in action in the Second Intifada, and I was shocked at how big the number was.
What are the numbers?
So in 2020, their Ministry of Invalids and Social Welfare released the numbers from the French War was 191,000 killed in action. From the American War was 849,000 killed in action. And then from what they call the wars in the defense of the fatherland, which is Cambodia and China, was 105,000. So let's call it from 45 to 90 when they pulled out of Cambodia. 1,146,000 or something like that Vietnamese soldiers were killed.
But we're not even talking about the carpet bombs or the napalm bombs, the Agent Orange that the U.S. put.
We're talking about killed in action.
Yeah, we're just talking about killed in action, but we're not talking about civilian casualties. We're not talking about small villages.
Vietnamese statistics are always a little fuzzy. So it calls them martyrs. So that's an interesting word. That's a political word. It doesn't say 849,000 soldiers were killed and 122,000 civilians, or whatever number it might be. And I've heard the Vietnamese government use 3 million Vietnamese killed during the war. But again, that number is very, very fuzzy. What time are you talking about? You're talking about both South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese. You're talking about civilians. You include Montagnards in that. I mean, there's no specificity about it. Pardon my butchering that word.
Specificity.
Thank you. Yes. Please dub that in for me, okay? When you propose this, okay?
I don't edit anything from these.
Great. Yes.
Dr. Veith, I really hope that you will come back on the podcast because I have more questions, and this episode is like a bite-sized chunk of what you've done, and I have more questions. But I look forward potentially to seeing you here. I think in a week or two, right?
April 13th, I speak at the RVN Cultural Center.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Dr. Veith.
Thank you very much. I would be happy to come back on anytime you want.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. Special thanks to Brittany Tran, to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast.